The back door of the diner groaned open on a single, rusted hinge, spilling the scent of frying bacon and stale coffee into the alley. Julian stood silhouetted against the fluorescent kitchen light, a spatula in one hand, his other beckoning me in. He didn't smile, but the gesture was enough. It was an invitation into a world I knew nothing about, a world of heat and steel and the rhythmic clang of a life in motion. I had been living a life of utter stillness, a quiet, gray existence in a rented room above a bookstore, and the noise alone was a shock to the system. "Julio?" His voice was lower than I expected, a gravelly rumble that seemed to come from deep in his chest. It vibrated in the tight space of the back entrance. I nodded, my own voice caught somewhere in my throat. I clutched the strap of my thin backpack, the only thing I owned that felt like it was truly mine. It held a few changes of clothes, a dog-eared book of poetry, and a sketchbook half filled with charcoal drawings of empty park benches and lonely streetlights. He wiped his free hand on his apron, a white cloth already streaked with grease and something that looked suspiciously like ketchup. "Good. You're on time. That's more than I can say for the last guy." He stepped aside, holding the door wider. "Get in before you let all the cold in and all the heat out." I shuffled past him, my shoulder brushing against his arm. He was solid, immovable, like a piece of the building itself. The air in the kitchen was thick and alive. It smelled of onions caramelizing on the flat top, of brewing coffee, of bleach and old metal. It was overwhelming, a sensory assault after the clean, crisp autumn air outside. A woman with a tight bun and a perpetual frown was furiously buttering toast, and a teenager, who couldn't have been more than 17, was wrestling with a mountain of unpeeled potatoes. Neither of them looked up. Julian let the door swing shut behind me, plunging the alley back into shadow. The sound of the latch clicking into place felt unnervingly final. He took a step toward me, his presence filling the already cramped space between the dishwashing station and a stainless steel prep table. I instinctively took a step back, my spine hitting the cold metal of a refrigerator. "Nervous?" he asked. It wasn't a question so much as a statement of fact. His eyes, a dark, unreadable brown, scanned my face. I felt pinned, dissected. "A little," I managed to admit, the words feeling thin and reedy in the cacophony of the kitchen. He grunted, a sound that wasn't unkind. "Don't be. It's just washing dishes. The water's hot, the soap's soap. The only way to screw it up is to not do it." He gestured toward the industrial sink, a cavernous metal basin already piled high with ceramic plates and coffee mugs. "That's your station. Apron's on the hook." I saw it then, a clean, folded white apron hanging from a hook by the sink. I reached for it, my fingers fumbling with the strings. I was all thumbs, my usual quiet competence deserting me under his steady gaze. He watched me struggle for a moment, his expression unchanging. I felt a hot flush creep up my neck, a familiar wave of shame at my own awkwardness. Then he moved. In 2 short steps, he closed the distance between us. He took the apron from my clumsy hands. I expected him to just hand it back, maybe offer a gruff word of instruction. Instead, he shook it out with a sharp snap of his wrists and held it up in front of me. I stood frozen as he looped the neck strap over my head, the starchy fabric falling into place against my chest. My heart began to beat a frantic, uneven rhythm. His proximity was dizzying. He smelled of coffee and something else, something clean and masculine, like soap and warm skin. His knuckles brushed the side of my neck as he adjusted the strap, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt straight down my spine. I held my breath, afraid that any movement would break whatever strange spell had fallen over this moment. He reached for the ties, his large hands moving with a surprising gentleness. He guided them around my waist, his fingers brushing against the small of my back. It was nothing, a purely functional gesture, but my body reacted as if it were an intimacy I hadn't earned. A shiver traced its way through me. "You're supposed to help," he murmured, his voice a low vibration so close to my ear. I blinked, my mind struggling to catch up. "What?" "Your hands," he said, his gaze dropping to my own, which were hanging uselessly at my sides. "You can't just stand there like a statue. This isn't a fitting." A ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. It was the first hint of humor I had seen from him, and it was disarming. He took my hands in his His were warm and calloused, the hands of a man who worked, who built and fixed and created. Mine felt soft and useless in his grip. He placed my palms flat against the front of the apron, just below my ribs, pressing them against the fabric. "Hold it steady," he instructed. Then he stepped closer, his body pressing lightly against my own as he reached around me to tie the knot at my back. My world shrank to the space of a few inches. All I could feel was the solid wall of his chest against my hands, the heat of him seeping through the thin cotton of my shirt, the whisper of his breath near my temple. My own breathing hitched. I was acutely aware of every point of contact, his thigh brushing against mine, the solid weight of his arm around my waist. The knot was tied with a firm, efficient tug, but he didn't step away. For a long, suspended moment, we just stood there, my hands pressed to my own chest, his body a warm, solid presence behind me. I could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart against my knuckles. It was a stark contrast to the frantic drumming in my own chest. The clatter of the kitchen faded into a distant hum. It was just us. Just this strange, unexpected, and terrifyingly intimate moment. He was the one who broke the silence. He leaned in, his lips brushing against the shell of my ear as he spoke, his voice a low, conspiratorial whisper. "There. Now you look like you belong here." Then he stepped back. The sudden absence of his warmth was a physical shock, leaving me feeling cold and exposed. He looked at me, his dark eyes lingering on my face for a second too long, as if searching for something. I couldn't decipher his expression. It was a blank mask of professionalism, but I could have sworn I saw a flicker of something else in their depths. Curiosity? Amusement? I couldn't be sure. He turned away, picking up his spatula from the prep table as if nothing had happened. "Gloria will show you where the extra soap is. Don't fall behind. Lunch rush hits in an hour." And just like that, he was back at the grill, his movements fluid and economical, a man completely in his element. He flipped a row of pancakes without looking, his attention already on the next order ticket. The moment was over. But for me, something had irrevocably shifted. I stood by the sink, my hands still feeling the phantom warmth of his chest, my skin still tingling where he had touched me. I had come here for a job, for a paycheck, for a way to keep from sinking completely. I hadn't expected to feel anything at all. Now, my entire body was thrumming with a strange, new, and dangerous current of awareness. "I belonged here," he'd said. I looked down at the pile of dirty dishes, the steam rising to meet me, and for the first time in a very long time, I wondered if he might be right. The days that followed fell into a grueling, yet surprisingly comforting, rhythm. My world became the 10-foot space between the dish pit and the drying racks. My hands, unaccustomed to anything more strenuous than holding a charcoal stick, were soon raw and chapped from the constant immersion in hot, soapy water. My back ached from leaning over the deep sink, and my ears rang with the constant clatter of plates and the shouts of servers calling out orders. But there was a strange peace in the mindless labor. It was honest work. You started with a mountain of dirty dishes, and through sheer effort, you transformed it into neat, gleaming stacks of clean ones. There was a clear beginning, a middle, and an end. My life, up until that point, had felt like a long, formless middle. Through it all, I watched Julian. It became a kind of secret obsession, a silent study conducted from my corner of the kitchen. He moved with an unhurried grace that seemed at odds with the frantic pace of the diner. He was the calm center of the storm, the axis around which everything else revolved. He never raised his voice, but a quiet word from him could stop a frantic server in her tracks. He could run the grill, the fryer, and the prep station simultaneously, his hands a blur of efficient motion, all while keeping a running inventory in his head and placating a difficult customer at the counter. I learned the geography of his body, the way the muscles in his forearms bunched when he lifted a heavy stockpot, the slight frown of concentration that creased the space between his eyebrows when he was plating a complex order, the way he would hook his thumbs into the front pockets of his jeans when he was talking to a supplier, his stance wide and solid. I memorized the sound of his footsteps, a steady, heavy tread that I could pick out from the frantic scuffing of everyone else. He rarely spoke to me directly after that first day. Our interactions were limited to brief, functional exchanges. "Need more clean plates, Leo. Watch your back. Hot pan coming through. but I felt his presence constantly. Sometimes, I would look up from the sudsy water and find him watching me. His gaze was always intense, unreadable. He wasn't smiling, nor was he frowning. He was simply observing, his dark eyes taking in the way I stacked the plates or scrubbed a stubborn pan. The moment our eyes met, he would look away, turning his attention back to the grill as if he had just been looking at a spot on the wall behind me. My mind, a machine built for overanalysis, went into overdrive. I replayed every glance, every near touch, every gruffly spoken word. I dissected them, searching for hidden meanings, for confirmation of the strange current that had passed between us on that first day. Was he just a hands-on boss checking on his new employee? Or was it something more? The uncertainty was a constant, low-grade hum beneath the surface of my thoughts, a quiet anxiety that was both terrifying and thrilling. One afternoon, during the lull between the lunch and dinner rush, I was wrestling with a particularly stubborn pot, the bottom coated in a thick layer of burnt chili. My arms ached, and I was losing the battle. I heard his heavy footsteps approach, but I didn't look up, too focused on my task. "You're going to scrub the finish off that thing," his voice rumbled from beside me. I startled, nearly dropping the pot. He was standing closer than I'd realized, leaning against the prep table with his arms crossed over his broad chest. He was watching my hands, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk playing on his lips. "It won't come off," I grumbled, more to myself than to him. "You're using brute force," he said. "That's not always the answer." He pushed off the table and stepped up to the sink beside me. The familiar scent of coffee and soap filled the small space. He reached past me, his arm brushing against mine, and turned off the hot water. "Let it soak. A little time, a little patience. It'll loosen up on its own." He picked up a box of baking soda from the shelf above the sink and sprinkled a generous amount into the pot, then added a splash of vinegar. The mixture fizzed and foamed. "Give it 10 minutes, he said, his voice quiet in the suddenly silent kitchen. Gloria was on her smoke break, and the potato kid had gone home for the day. It was just us. We stood there for a moment in an awkward silence, the only sound the gentle hiss of the baking soda mixture. I was acutely aware of his proximity, of the warmth radiating from his body. I kept my eyes fixed on the pot, my heart hammering against my ribs. I felt like I was the one soaking, my carefully constructed defenses slowly dissolving under his quiet presence. "You draw?" he asked, his question catching me completely off guard. I looked at him, surprised. "What?" He nodded toward my backpack, which was tucked away on a low shelf. A corner of my sketchbook was sticking out. "I see you with that thing sometimes, on your breaks." Sitting out back, a hot flush of embarrassment washed over me. I felt exposed, as if he had been reading my private thoughts. My drawings were personal, a collection of my loneliness and observations. The idea of him seeing them, of him knowing that part of me, was mortifying. "It's nothing," I mumbled, turning my attention back to the sink. "Just scribbles." "I doubt that," he said softly. He didn't press the issue, but his words hung in the air between us. He saw me. He actually saw me, not just as the quiet dishwasher, but as someone who sat alone in the alley and drew. The thought was both comforting and deeply unsettling. A few days later, he proved it again. I was out back on my 15-minute break, my sketchbook open on my lap. I was trying to capture the way the late afternoon sun cast long, distorted shadows of the dumpsters against the brick wall. It was a bleak subject, but there was a strange beauty in it, a stark geometry that appealed to me. The back door creaked open, and Julian stepped out. He held 2 steaming mugs in his hands. He walked over to the overturned milk crate I was sitting on and held one out to me. "Coffee," he said. It wasn't a question. I took the mug, my fingers brushing against his. The warmth of the ceramic seeped into my cold hands. "Thanks," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I instinctively tried to close my sketchbook, but he was too quick. He leaned over, his gaze falling on the page. I froze, my entire body tensing in anticipation of his judgment. He would see the loneliness in the lines, the emptiness I was trying to capture. He would think it was strange, morbid. He was silent for a long moment, studying the drawing. I held my breath. The silence stretched, becoming unbearable. I was about to stammer out an apology, an explanation, when he finally spoke. "You have a good eye," he said, his voice low and serious. He tapped a finger on the page, indicating a specific shadow I had heavily cross-hatched. You see the things other people ignore. I looked up at him, my throat tight. He wasn't making fun of me. He wasn't dismissing it. He was looking at me with an expression of genuine interest, of respect. It was a look I wasn't used to seeing from anyone. He straightened up and took a sip of his own coffee, his eyes scanning the alley as if seeing it for the first time. I've been looking at this alley for 10 years, he said, his voice thoughtful. And all I've ever seen is a place to put the trash. You see, that? He nodded toward my drawing again. He didn't say anything else. He just stood there beside me, drinking his coffee in a comfortable silence. The gesture was simple, just a shared cup of coffee in a dirty alley. But it felt monumental. It was a bridge between our two worlds, a quiet acknowledgement that we were more than just a boss and his employee. He saw something in me, something I thought I had kept carefully hidden, and he wasn't repulsed by it. He was intrigued. As I sat there, sipping the hot, bitter coffee, a tiny, unfamiliar seed of hope began to take root in the barren soil of my heart. Maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as invisible as I thought. The weeks bled into one another, and the diner became the fixed point of my existence. I learned its rhythms by heart. The pre-dawn quiet when the only sound was the hum of the refrigerators and the gurgle of the coffee maker. The frenetic chaos of the lunch rush, a whirlwind of shouted orders and clattering plates. The slow, lazy afternoon lull, when the air grew thick with the smell of stale coffee and the low murmur of the town's old-timers swapping stories at the counter, and the final, weary push of the dinner service, followed by the satisfying ritual of cleaning and closing, of setting the world right again for the next day. My life took on a shape it hadn't had before. I was no longer just adrift. I was the guy who washed the dishes at Julian's diner. It was a small, unassuming identity, but it was an identity nonetheless. I had a place to be, a purpose to fulfill, and at the center of that purpose was Julian. Our silent dance continued, a shared glance across the crowded kitchen that lasted a fraction of a second too long. His hand brushing my back as he squeezed past me in the narrow walkway, a touch that was purely functional but felt charged with an unspoken energy. One evening, as I was emptying the trash, my hand slipped on a wet patch on the floor. I stumbled, and he was there, his hand shooting out to grip my arm, steadying me. His grip was firm, his touch lingering even after I had regained my balance. "Careful," he'd said, his voice a low rumble. His eyes held mine, and in their dark depths, I saw a flicker of something that looked like concern, something deeper than a boss's worry over an employee's potential injury. I had simply nodded, unable to speak, my skin burning where his fingers had been. These small moments became the focal points of my days. I collected them like precious stones, turning them over and over in my mind during the long, quiet hours in my rented room. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, and replay the way he had looked at my drawing, the way his voice had sounded when he'd called my name, the feeling of his hand on my arm. I was building a narrative, a story of unspoken attraction, but I was terrified that I was the only one reading it. He was an enigma, a man of few words and even fewer overt expressions of emotion. For all I knew, I was projecting my own loneliness, my own desperate yearning for connection, onto a man who was simply being a decent boss. The fear of misinterpretation was a constant companion. It made me cautious, hesitant. I kept my head down, did my work, and hoarded my secret observations. I never initiated a conversation beyond what was necessary. I never lingered. I was afraid that if I pushed, if I tested the fragile web of tension between us, it would snap, and I would be left with nothing but the cold, hard reality of my own foolishness. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday night in late October. A storm had been threatening all day, and it finally broke just as we were closing up. The rain came down in solid, wind-driven sheets, hammering against the diner's flat roof and turning the street outside into a churning river. Gloria had managed to get a ride home with one of the last customers, but I had walked to work, and my small apartment was a good 20-minute trek away. "You're not walking in this," Julian stated, not asked, as he locked the front door. He was standing by the counter, wiping it down with a damp cloth, his movements as methodical and unhurried as ever, even with the storm raging outside. "I'll be fine," I said, my voice betraying my uncertainty. "It's just water." He stopped wiping and looked at me, a real look. He sighed, a sound of weary exasperation that was somehow not directed at me, but at the situation, at my stubbornness. Don't be an idiot, Leo. You'll be soaked through before you get to the end of the block. You'll catch your death. He tossed the rag into the sink and disappeared into the back office. He returned a moment later, dangling a set of keys from his finger. I'll drive you. You don't have to do that, I protested, feeling like a burden. I can wait it out. The forecast says this isn't letting up until morning, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I live upstairs. I'm not going anywhere. It's no trouble. He grabbed his jacket from a hook by the back door and tossed me a dry, folded towel. Come on. I followed him out the back, the wind and rain hitting us with a physical force. He led the way to an old, dark green pickup truck parked in the alley. It was a beast of a machine, solid and dependable, much like the man himself. We climbed inside, the truck's cab feeling like a small, safe haven from the storm. The rain drummed a relentless rhythm on the roof. He started the engine, and the truck rumbled to life. The drive was short, the streets deserted. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour. We didn't speak. The silence wasn't awkward, but filled with a kind of heavy significance. It felt different from the silences in the kitchen, which were always underscored by the potential for interruption. Here, in the dark intimacy of the truck, we were truly alone. He pulled up in front of my building. The engine idled, a low, steady hum beneath us. I should have thanked him and gotten out. But I didn't move. I couldn't. So this is where the artist lives, he said, his voice quiet. He was looking at the bookstore below my apartment, its windows dark. Something like that, I replied, my eyes fixed on the rhythmic sweep of the wipers. He turned in his seat, his arm resting on the back of the bench, his body angled toward me. The movement shifted the whole dynamic of the small space. It went from a driver and a passenger to two people facing each other. You ever think about leaving this town? He asked. The question was unexpected, personal. I shrugged, a small, helpless gesture. Sometimes. All the time. I don't know where I'd go. What are you running from, Leo? He asked, his voice soft, but the question was sharp, direct. It was the same question he'd hinted at before, and it hit me with the force of a physical blow. I finally turned to look at him. In the dim glow of the dashboard lights, his face was a landscape of shadows and angles. His expression was serious, his eyes searching mine. He wasn't being nosy. He was genuinely asking. He wanted to know. And in that moment, something inside me broke. Some wall I had been carefully constructing for years, a wall of silence and self-preservation, crumbled to dust. The vulnerability was terrifying, but the thought of lying to him, of deflecting with a joke or a non-answer, felt impossible. Myself, mostly, I said, the admission a raw, painful whisper. From the person I was supposed to be, I guess. The one my family expected. The one who was supposed to get a normal job, marry a nice girl, have a couple of kids. The words tumbled out, clumsy and unpracticed. I tried, for a while, and it was like I was suffocating. So I just left. I've been drifting ever since. I expected him to say something, to offer a platitude, or, worse, to look away in discomfort. But he just listened, his gaze never leaving my face. He was giving my confession the weight it deserved, honoring it with his full attention. When I was finished, a heavy silence fell between us again, but this time it was different. It was a space filled with my truth, with the pieces of myself I had just laid bare. He reached out, his hand covering mine where it rested on the seat between us. His touch was warm and steady, a grounding force in the swirling chaos of my emotions. It wasn't a gesture of pity. It was a gesture of understanding, of acceptance. You don't have to pretend around me, Leo, he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. He was echoing his words from that night in the diner, but this time, the meaning was crystal clear. It wasn't about work. It was about me. All of me. He gave my hand a gentle squeeze. You're not just the dishwasher, he said, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. I knew that from the first day. My breath caught in my throat. He saw me. He had seen me all along. The glances, the small kindnesses, the shared coffee, they hadn't been in my head. They were real. The rain hammered against the roof, a wild, chaotic percussion. But inside the truck, a profound stillness had fallen. The tension that had been simmering between us for weeks had finally come to a head, brought to the surface by the storm and a moment of shared vulnerability. I looked at his hand covering mine, his strong, calloused fingers intertwined with my own. It felt right. It felt like coming home. I didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long, long time, I wasn't afraid. I was just present, and I had a feeling that was all he had ever wanted me to be. The air in the truck cab grew thick, charged with everything that had just been said and everything that hadn't. My confession hung between us, a raw, shivering thing I had let out of its cage. Julian's hand was still covering mine, a warm, solid weight that was both a comfort and a source of unbearable tension. Every nerve ending in my body was screamingly aware of the point of contact, of the texture of his skin against mine, of the slight pressure of his thumb as it began to stroke the back of my hand. The motion was subtle, almost unconscious, but it was deliberate. It was a question being asked without words. My heart, which had been hammering against my ribs, seemed to stop altogether, waiting. I could feel his gaze on me, steady and intense in the dim light. I knew I should look at him, but I couldn't. I was afraid of what I would see in his eyes, afraid of what he would see in mine. He was the one who broke the spell. He shifted, his body turning more fully toward me on the bench seat. The movement was slow, measured, giving me every opportunity to pull away, to break the contact, to retreat back into the safety of my shell. I didn't. I couldn't. I was paralyzed, caught in the gravitational pull of his presence. "Leo," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. Just my name. But the way he said it, filled with a kind of weary tenderness, made my entire body ache. I finally forced myself to look up, to meet his eyes. The dashboard lights cast his face in sharp relief, illuminating the weary lines around his eyes, the determined set of his jaw. There was no pity in his expression, no judgment. There was just a deep, quiet understanding. And something else. Something that looked terrifyingly like my own yearning, reflected back at me. This was it. The tipping point. The moment where the subtext that had been humming between us for weeks was about to become text. The air crackled with it. The rain on the roof was a distant, forgotten sound. My entire universe had contracted to the space between our two bodies. He brought his other hand up, his movements still so slow, so deliberate. He cupped my jaw, his thumb stroking gently along my cheekbone. His skin was rough, calloused from work, but his touch was unbelievably gentle. I flinched, not out of fear, but out of the sheer, overwhelming shock of the contact. It had been so long since anyone had touched me with such tenderness. My eyes fluttered shut. I couldn't bear the intensity of his gaze any longer. I just focused on the feeling of his hand on my skin, the solid weight of it, the warmth of it. He was real. This was real. "Look at me," he murmured. I opened my eyes. He had moved closer. His face was only inches from mine. I could see the flecks of gold in his dark brown eyes, could feel the warmth of his breath on my lips. He smelled of rain and coffee and the clean, masculine scent that was uniquely his. "Is this okay?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the idling engine. The question was a gift. It was a lifeline, an offer of an escape route I knew I wouldn't take. He was giving me all the power, letting me know that this was my choice. He wasn't pushing, wasn't assuming. He was asking. I couldn't find my voice. The words were trapped in my throat, a tangled knot of fear and desire. So I just nodded. A small, jerky movement, but it was enough. A flicker of relief, of something like triumph, crossed his face. He leaned in, closing the final inch between us. His lips met mine. It wasn't a Hollywood kiss. It wasn't explosive or desperate. It was quiet. It was sure. It was achingly gentle. His lips were soft, warm, and tasted faintly of coffee. He didn't demand anything, didn't push for more. He just held me there, his lips pressed against mine, his hand still cupping my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. It was a kiss of acknowledgement, of confirmation. It said, "I see you. I know you. You are safe with me." All the tension, all the anxiety, all the fear I had been carrying for weeks, for years, seemed to drain out of me. It was replaced by a profound, overwhelming sense of rightness. This was what I had been yearning for, this simple, honest connection, this feeling of being truly seen. I let out a shuddering breath I didn't realize I had been holding, and my own hand, the one not trapped beneath his, came up to rest on his chest. I could feel the steady, solid beat of his heart under my palm. It was a comforting, life-affirming rhythm. I leaned into the kiss, a silent response, a surrender. He seemed to understand. He deepened the kiss slightly, his other arm coming around to rest on my waist, pulling me closer. It was still gentle, still unhurried, but there was a new current of emotion running through it. A current of long-suppressed desire, of relief. When he finally pulled back, it was only by a few inches. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes still closed. We stayed like that for a long moment, just breathing the same air, our bodies still connected. The storm raged on outside, but in our small, private world, everything was calm. "You should get inside," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Before you get cold." I didn't want to move. I wanted to stay in this bubble, this perfect, suspended moment, forever. But I knew he was right. I slowly pulled back, the loss of his warmth an immediate ache. "Okay," I whispered. He didn't let go of my hand. He held it for a moment longer, his thumb stroking the back of it one last time before he finally released me. I opened the truck door, the sound of the storm rushing in to fill the silence. I grabbed my backpack and the towel he had given me, and I slid out of the cab. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the rain plastering my hair to my forehead, and looked back at him. He was watching me, his face silhouetted against the dim glow of the dashboard. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. A promise. A beginning. I turned and ran for the shelter of my apartment building's entrance. I didn't look back again. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking, and let myself into the quiet, musty-smelling hallway. I climbed the stairs to my room, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. I closed my apartment door and leaned against it, my heart pounding a wild, frantic rhythm against my ribs. I brought my fingers to my lips. They were still tingling, still warm from his kiss. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a figment of my lonely imagination. It was real. Julian, the steady, stoic, unreadable man from the diner, had kissed me, and I had kissed him back. A slow smile spread across my face, the first genuine, unburdened smile I had felt in years. The future was still a vast, terrifying unknown. But for the first time, it felt like it might hold something other than just more of the same. It felt like it might hold a little bit of warmth, a little bit of hope, a little bit of him. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm, my body buzzing with a nervous energy that was entirely new to me. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that felt scrubbed clean, the early morning light sharp and clear. As I walked to the diner, everything seemed more vibrant, the colors of the autumn leaves more saturated, the air crisper. Or maybe it was just me. Maybe I was the one who had been washed clean. The moment I pushed open the back door of the diner, however, a wave of anxiety washed over me, cold and sharp. What if I had imagined it all? What if the intimacy of the storm, the vulnerability of my confession, had created a moment that meant nothing in the cold light of day? What if he regretted it? The kitchen was already humming with the familiar morning routine. Gloria was at the toast station, her movements brisk and efficient. The new prep kid, a lanky teenager named Sam, was chopping onions with ferocious concentration. And Julian was at the grill, his back to me. He didn't turn around when I came in. He just kept working, flipping pancakes, laying out strips of bacon, his movements as fluid and controlled as ever. My heart sank. The easy camaraderie of the previous night felt a million miles away. We were back in our prescribed roles. He was the boss, and I was the dishwasher. The kiss might as well have happened in another lifetime. I walked to my station in a daze, my earlier hope curdling into a familiar, bitter disappointment. Of course, he regretted it. I was a mess, a drifter who drew sad pictures in an alley. He was a business owner, a respected member of the community. What could he possibly see in me? I had been a fool to think it could be anything more than a moment of pity, a brief lapse in judgment. I tied on my apron, the simple act feeling like putting on a suit of armor. I turned on the water and submerged my hands in the hot, sudsy depths, focusing on the physical sensation, trying to block out the roaring in my head. I scrubbed plates with a frantic energy, trying to sweat out the anxiety, the shame. We didn't speak for the first hour. The breakfast rush hit, and we were all too busy to do anything but work. But the silence between us was a living thing, a heavy, suffocating presence in the crowded kitchen. I avoided looking in his direction, keeping my eyes fixed on the sink, on the endless stream of dirty dishes. I could feel his presence, though, a constant awareness at the edge of my senses. I was terrified that if I looked up and met his eyes, I would see dismissal or, worse, nothing at all. The rush finally began to ebb. The frantic pace slowed to a steady hum. I was stacking clean plates on the drying rack when he appeared at my elbow. I tensed, my whole body going rigid. "Coffee's fresh," he said, his voice neutral. I just nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I kept my back to him, pretending to be intensely focused on arranging the plates. He didn't leave. He just stood there for a moment. I could feel him waiting. For what? An acknowledgement? A conversation? I didn't know how to do this, how to act normal after what had happened. Finally, he let out a quiet sigh and walked away. I squeezed my eyes shut, a fresh wave of misery washing over me. I had blown it. My silence, my fear, had confirmed his regrets. I had pushed him away. A few minutes later, a mug appeared on the edge of the sink, right in my line of sight. It was white, heavy ceramic, filled to the brim with black coffee, steam rising in a fragrant cloud. I looked up. Julian was back at the grill, his attention seemingly on a strip of bacon he was turning with a pair of tongs. But I had seen the deliberate way he had placed the mug there, a quiet, simple offering. My heart did a painful little flip. It was the same gesture as the coffee in the alley. A bridge, a peace offering. It wasn't a rejection. It was an invitation. I picked up the mug, my hands still damp. The warmth of it was a comfort. I took a sip. It was hot, strong, and bitter, exactly how I liked it. He remembered. I chanced to look over at him. He was watching me over his shoulder, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were soft. He gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, the same nod from the truck the night before. And then he turned back to his work. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was a reassurance, a quiet confirmation that last night was real, and it was not a mistake. The knot of anxiety in my stomach began to loosen. We were okay. We were just figuring it out. The rest of the day passed in a strange, new kind of tension. It wasn't the anxious, uncertain tension of the weeks before. It was a shared, secret awareness. Every time our eyes met across the kitchen, a spark seemed to jump between us. Every accidental brush of our hands as we reached for the same utensil felt charged with a new significance. We were navigating a new landscape, learning the steps to a dance we had never performed before. It was awkward and clumsy. We were two men who were not used to expressing our feelings, trying to communicate in a language of stolen glances and small, quiet gestures. The real test came late that afternoon. A couple of regulars, two burly construction workers named Frank and Dale, were sitting at the counter, their voices loud in the quiet diner. I was bringing a stack of clean glasses out to the front, and as I passed them, Frank made a crude, loud comment about a local politician, punctuating it with a homophobic slur. I froze. The word, ugly and sharp, hit me like a slap. It was a word that had been used against me before, a word that had the power to make me feel small and worthless. I felt the blood drain from my face, my old instinct to make myself invisible, to retreat, kicking in. Before I could move, Julian was there. He had been refilling the salt shakers at the end of the counter, and he moved with a quiet, deadly speed. He placed a hand flat on the counter in front of Frank, the sound a sharp slap in the quiet room. "We don't use that kind of language in here, Frank," he said. His voice was dangerously soft, but it carried an unmistakable weight of authority. It cut through the air like a knife. Frank, surprised, looked up at him. "What?" "It was just a joke, Jules." "It wasn't funny," Julian said, his eyes cold and hard as stone. "And it's not welcome in my place. Ever. You understand me?" The two men looked at each other, then back at Julian. They saw the unyielding steel in his expression and seemed to shrink in their seats. Dale mumbled an apology. Frank just grunted and looked down at his coffee cup. Julian held their gaze for a moment longer, ensuring his message had been received. Then he turned his head and looked directly at me. I was still standing there, frozen, the stack of glasses clutched in my hands. His expression softened instantly. His eyes asked a silent question. "Are you okay?" I gave him a small, grateful nod. A wave of emotion, so strong it almost buckled my knees, washed over me. It was a fierce, protective feeling. In that moment, He hadn't just been a boss defending the decorum of his establishment. He had been defending me. He had stood between me and the ugliness of the world, a solid, unmovable shield. He gave me another one of his small, significant nods, and then he went back to his salt shakers as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened. He had seen my hurt, and he had acted. He had claimed me, in a way, in front of everyone. He had shown me, without a single word of affection, that I mattered, that I was worth protecting. The quiet reassurance of the coffee mug had been for me. This was for us. That evening, as we were closing, the silence between us was no longer awkward or uncertain. It was comfortable, filled with a new, shared understanding. I finished my work at the dish pit and was untying my apron when he walked over. "I live upstairs," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet kitchen. It was a statement of fact, but it felt like a question, an offer. "I know," I said softly. He hooked his thumbs in his pockets, a familiar gesture, but tonight it seemed less about confidence and more about a kind of nervous energy. I was going to make some dinner. Nothing fancy, just pasta. He looked at me, his dark eyes vulnerable, hopeful. He was taking a risk, moving us from the semi-public space of the diner, the space of our employment, into the private space of his home. He was inviting me in. My heart was pounding, but for the first time, it was with excitement, not fear. This was the conscious choice. This was the step from a secret, stolen moment into the possibility of something real. "I like pasta," I said, a smile finally breaking through my carefully controlled exterior. The relief that washed over his face was so profound it was almost comical. The tension seemed to drain out of his shoulders. A real, genuine smile touched his lips, transforming his usually stoic features. It made him look younger, less burdened. "Good," he said, his own smile growing wider. "That's good." He led me out the back door, but instead of going to the alley, he led me to a narrow, steep staircase I had never noticed before, tucked away in a corner. "My private entrance," he explained. As I followed him up the stairs, leaving the familiar world of the diner behind, I felt like I was crossing a threshold. I was leaving the lonely, drifting version of myself at the bottom of the stairs. I didn't know who I would be at the top, but I knew I wouldn't be alone. I was walking toward the smell of pasta, toward the warmth of a small apartment above a diner, toward a quiet man who saw the things other people ignored. I was walking toward a new beginning. Julian's apartment was exactly what I should have expected, and yet it surprised me. It was simple, uncluttered, and deeply masculine. A large, worn leather sofa dominated the main room, facing a wall of floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. The books were not for show. They were a chaotic mix of dog-eared paperbacks, thick historical tomes, and cookbooks stained with sauces and oils. A heavy wooden coffee table held a neat stack of magazines and a single, half-empty coffee mug. The air smelled of old paper, coffee, and faintly of the diner downstairs. It smelled like him. There was no art on the walls. They were bare, painted a stark, clean white. It was the only impersonal thing about the space. Everything else, from the scuffed wooden floors to the collection of mismatched coffee mugs on an open shelf in the kitchen, spoke of a life lived, of quiet habits and solitary comforts. It was the space of a man who was self-sufficient, who didn't need, or perhaps didn't expect, anyone else to share his world. "It's not much," he said, his voice sounding a little uncertain as he watched me take it all in. He was standing by the small kitchen area, shrugging out of his jacket. He seemed different up here, less the stoic, in-control owner of the diner, and more just a man in his own home. A little awkward, a little vulnerable. "It's great," I said, and I meant it. It was a calm, quiet space. A refuge. "I like your books." He glanced at the shelves, a faint smile touching his lips. "They're good company." The words held a hint of a loneliness that mirrored my own. We were two solitary men, finding our companionship in different ways. He in his books, me in my sketchbook. He moved into the kitchen with a familiar, easy grace. "You can, have a seat. Or whatever. Make yourself at home." I hovered awkwardly in the middle of the room for a moment, feeling like an intruder. Then I walked over to the bookshelves, running my fingers lightly over the spines. I saw novels I loved, histories I'd always meant to read. It was another piece of him, another clue to the man behind the apron. "Can I help?" I asked, turning back to the kitchen. He He was filling a large pot with water at the sink. He looked over his shoulder, a surprised but pleased expression on his face. Sure, you can chop the garlic. If you think your hands can handle a knife after a day in the dish pit. The teasing was gentle, a continuation of the new, easier dynamic that was forming between us. I smiled. I think I can manage. He handed me a cutting board and a knife, and we fell into a comfortable rhythm, working side by side in the small kitchen. The space was even more intimate than the kitchen downstairs. Our shoulders brushed as we reached for things. Our hands nearly touched as we both went for the olive oil. But now, instead of causing a jolt of anxiety, these small contacts felt natural, right? I minced the garlic while he browned some sausage in a pan. The kitchen filled with the rich, savory smells. It was a deeply domestic scene, a quiet intimacy that I had only ever read about in books or observed from a distance. I had never imagined myself as a participant. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. The silence was filled with the sounds of cooking, the sizzle of the pan, the chop of the knife, the clink of utensils. It was a productive, companionable silence. I found myself relaxing in a way I hadn't realized I was capable of. The constant, buzzing anxiety that was the background noise of my life had faded to a barely perceptible hum. After a while, as the sauce simmered on the stove, Julian poured 2 glasses of red wine, handing one to me. He leaned against the counter opposite me, taking a sip from his glass. So, he said, his voice quiet. The drawing of the alley. Have you finished it? The question caught me off guard. I had almost forgotten about our conversation that day. Yeah, I think so. Can I see it sometime? He asked. There was no pressure in his voice, only genuine curiosity. I felt that old, familiar instinct to hide, to protect that private part of myself. But then I looked at him, at his open, honest face, and the fear receded. He wasn't going to judge me. He was the one who understood. He was the one who saw beauty in the shadows. Okay, I said, my voice a little shaky. Yeah, sometime. He nodded, a slow, satisfied smile on his face. Good. We ate at a small wooden table tucked into a corner of the main room. The pasta was simple, but it was one of the best meals I had ever had. Maybe it was the food, or the wine, or the company, but a warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. As we ate, we started to talk. Really talk. I told him about the towns I had drifted through, the dead-end jobs I had worked. He told me about growing up in this town, about inheriting the diner from his parents, about the dreams he had once had of being a history professor. We were filling in the empty spaces, sketching in the backstories that had led us to this moment, to this table. After dinner, I helped him clear the plates. We were standing by the sink, a mirror image of our usual positions downstairs, but the context was entirely different. This time, there was no mountain of dishes, no pressure of the next rush. There was just the two of us, the warm glow of the kitchen light, and the quiet hum of the refrigerator. I finished rinsing a plate and turned to put it in the drying rack. He was standing right behind me, closer than I had realized. I stopped, the plate still in my hand. He reached out and took it from me, placing it carefully on the rack. Then his hands came to rest on my waist. My breath hitched. He slowly turned me to face him, his gaze intense, searching. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, his thumbs stroking small, soothing circles on my hips. This was it, the moment of truth. The kiss in the truck had been a beginning, a question. This felt like an answer. I lifted my hands and placed them on his chest, right over his heart. It was beating a strong, steady rhythm under my palm. I felt my own heart begin to match its tempo. He leaned down and kissed me again. This kiss was different from the one in the truck. It was just as gentle, but it was deeper, more confident. It was a kiss that spoke of certainty, of a decision made. It was filled with all the unspoken words, all the stolen glances, all the quiet yearning of the past few weeks. I melted into him, my body relaxing against his. I wrapped my arms around his neck, pulling him closer, deepening the kiss. All the fear, all the hesitation, was gone. There was only this. Only him. He pulled back, resting his forehead against mine, just as he had in the truck. His breathing was a little ragged. Stay, he said, his voice a rough whisper. It wasn't a command or a plea. It was a simple, profound invitation. Stay here, with me. Stop running. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. tears of relief, of a joy so overwhelming it was almost painful. For years, I had been defined by leaving. I was the one who walked away, who never put down roots. The idea of staying, of choosing to be in one place, with one person, was both terrifying and the most wonderful thing I had ever heard. "Okay," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. He led me from the kitchen into the main room, his hand holding mine. He sat down on the worn leather sofa and pulled me down with him. I curled up against his side, my head resting on his shoulder. He wrapped his arm around me, holding me close. We didn't talk anymore. We just sat there in the quiet, dimly lit room, listening to the faint sounds of the town settling down for the night. The weight of his arm around me was a comfort, an anchor. I felt safe. I felt home. I looked at the blank, white walls of his apartment. They were like an empty canvas, a story waiting to be told. And for the first time, I felt like my own story wasn't over. It wasn't just a series of lonely sketches of empty spaces. It was just beginning, and I had a feeling it was going to be filled with color. My final thought before I drifted off to sleep, tucked against the solid warmth of this quiet, steady man, was not one of fear or uncertainty. It was a simple, startling realization. I was no longer just an observer, watching life from the sidelines. I was here. I was a part of the picture, and it was more beautiful than anything I could have ever drawn.